The moment Morin walked out the door, a shift occurred within me. It wasn't anger or sadness that I felt, but rather a sense of clarity. Sitting at the kitchen table, I gazed at the untouched cup of coffee before me. The steam had dissipated, much like the warmth in our relationship. Morin had mentioned it was just a brief weekend getaway, a chance for her to rediscover herself. However, deep down, I couldn't ignore the feeling that lingered within me. A husband always knows. The recent months had been marked by long hours at work, distant conversations, and a phone consistently turned face down. Despite my attempts to dismiss these signs as mere overthinking or paranoia, they persisted. Yet as I heard the faint sound of her car departing from the driveway, an unexpected sensation washed over me: relief. It wasn't fear or devastation. Rather, it was a quiet and surprising relief. In that moment, I realized I didn't have to wait. I didn't have to play the role of a faithful dog awaiting its owner's return at the door. Morin may have believed she held all the power in our marriage, but this realization brought a newfound sense of empowerment within me. She had believed she could venture out, explore freely, and return to a husband who would patiently await her decision about their future together. But she was mistaken. I wasn't waiting for her. I had already moved on. When she returned, she would find that I was not the same man she had left behind. The atmosphere in the house changed once she departed, becoming lighter, as if a weight had been lifted, allowing me to breathe freely for the first time in years. Standing up from the table, I stretched my arms, sensing a new and unfamiliar feeling of liberation washing over me. It was peculiar. Instead of pain, anger, or confusion, all I experienced was a profound sense of relief. I wasn't oblivious to her actions. Morin had been restless for some time, treating me as if I were a tired old story she had read too many times. The subtle signs were there. Her increased desire to socialize, the extra attention she paid to her appearance before going out with friends, the way she kept her phone just out of my reach, and how she had already packed her suitcase. As easily as I walked into her bedroom, taking in the half-empty closet, her side of the bed was still unmade. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the sheets, but it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a reset. I sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing my hands over my face. The truth was, I had been living on autopilot for too long, stuck in a marriage that felt more like an obligation than a partnership. I had let myself believe that love was supposed to feel like this, like something that dulled over time, like something that was just endured. But why? Why was I holding on to something that was already gone? A small bitter chuckle escaped my lips. Morin had thought she was the one in control, that she was calling the shots, that she could go off on her little adventure, get her thrill, and come back to the man who would always be waiting. But she had underestimated me. I wasn't waiting. I had already moved on. By the time she came back, she wouldn't recognize the life she left behind that first night. Right alone, I expected to feel uneasy, maybe even heartbroken. But instead, the house, our house, felt like an empty hotel room. A place I had stayed in for too long, waiting for something that was never going to happen. The silence wasn't oppressive. It was liberating. I walked through the living room, noticing things I hadn't paid attention to in years. The framed wedding photo on the shelf. It suddenly looked like strangers, frozen in time. I picked it up, running a finger over the glass. The woman in the picture was smiling, but I barely recognized her anymore, or maybe I had never really seen her. I placed it face down on the table. I wasn't sure why, but I knew I didn't want to look at it anymore. I made my way to the bedroom, but as I reached for the door, something stopped me. A weird hesitation, like stepping back into that room would be stepping into something I no longer belonged to. Instead, I turned around and went to the guest room. It was smaller, simpler. Just a bed, a desk, a nightstand. But for the first time in years, I slept peacefully without the weight of another person's presence. There were no expectations, no concerns about the person next to me being awake and waiting for me to fall asleep first. It was a sense of tranquility that I hadn't experienced in a long time. The next morning, I woke up early to a sky painted in soft hues of pink and gray as the sun began to rise. As I stretched, I felt a lightness in my chest that had been absent for years. It was a Saturday, a weekend where I could just be myself. I made a strong cup of coffee and sat on the back porch, observing the world coming to life around me. The birds chirped, cars hummed in the distance, and life carried on as I was about to do. I reached for my phone, hesitating for a moment. It was the first time I didn't feel the urge to check for Morin's messages. I knew there wouldn't be any, and I found myself indifferent. Instead of focusing on Morin, I scrolled through my contacts and noticed a name that hadn't crossed my mind in a while: Angela. We used to be close before marriage, before life became complicated, before Morin slowly drifted away. I disconnected from the people who once held significance in my life. Contemplating whether it would be awkward to reach out after all this time, I realized I owed Morin nothing. With resolve, I pressed the call button. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Joel, this is a pleasant surprise," to which I responded with a smile. Acknowledging the passage of time, he let out a soft chuckle. What had initially seemed like a hesitant attempt to contact Morin evolved into an unexpected turn of events. A weekend filled with the promise of new beginnings. As I caught up with Angela in the morning, it felt surreal to hear her voice once again after so many years. There was a certain clarity in reconnecting with someone who knew the essence of my former self. The person I was before I started compromising my instincts and settling for a life that didn't align with my true desires. Angela and I shared a history that wasn't complicated, but instead served as a reminder of the person I used to be before life altered me beyond recognition. We reminisced about past experiences, and I shared with her my feelings about the house, how it seemed unfamiliar without Morin's presence. In return, she opened up about her own recent move back to town after years of living elsewhere. After some discussion, she inquired, "So what's new with you?" I paused, contemplating whether or not to reveal my innermost thoughts. Finally, I carefully replied, "My wife has left for the weekend seeking something new." Angela went silent for a moment before letting out a knowing chuckle. "Let me guess she expects you to patiently wait for her return, as if nothing has changed," she remarked. I shook my head in response. "Actually, I'm not sure if her return even matters to me." There was a brief silence before Angela softly laughed again. "Joel, I don't think you realize the significance of what you just said." Perhaps she was right. Maybe without realizing it, I had already begun to detach myself. As we ended our conversation, making plans to catch up soon, a feeling of anticipation stirred within me. It wasn't guilt or doubt. It was a sense of excitement. I re-entered the house and observed it closely. Over the years, it had reflected Morin's style. Modern furniture, neutral tones, meticulously arranged decor. Everything seemed perfect, from the placement of books to the fragrance of lavender and vanilla candles lingering in the air. However, for the first time, I viewed it with new eyes. It was not a home but a facade, a carefully crafted display of a marriage that had lost its meaning long ago. Running my fingers over the marble countertop, memories flooded back of Morin's disinterest during our conversations and her emotional detachment. As I gazed at the expensive wine glass she had chosen, I couldn't ignore the signs I had overlooked for so long. After carefully placing the mug on the counter, it made a sharp clink. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I dusted off the old stereo tucked away in the closet, the one Morin always called an eyesore. As the familiar tunes filled the house, not the soft, trendy background music she typically played, but music that resonated with me, I felt something stir inside me. Cranking up the volume, I grabbed my coffee and leaned against the counter, enveloped in the nostalgic sound that now filled the void Morin had left. Finally, for the first time in years, the house felt like my own sanctuary. Amid cleaning the living room, my phone buzzed with a text from Morin. My stomach clenched, but not with the familiar dread or anticipation, only with curiosity. The message simply read, "Hey, hope you're doing okay, won't have service for a while, talk soon." No apology, no affection, just a mere placeholder to keep me grounded while she was away on whatever task she had left to do. He still believed I was waiting, but I simply smirked as I typed a brief reply: "Enjoy your weekend." There were no questions, no sense of desperation in my words. It was a detached, straightforward sentence that conveyed everything she needed to understand. She had left thinking she was in control, but she was mistaken. That evening, I did something unexpected. I took off my wedding ring, not out of anger or in a moment of dramatic sorrow, but with a simple and deliberate gesture. Placing it on the nightstand, I gazed at the bare space on my finger and felt a sense of liberation and lightness wash over me. As I contemplated the significance of this act, I realized that by the time Morin returned, she would encounter a different man than the one she left behind. I had undergone a subtle but profound transformation, and I had a feeling she wouldn't be pleased with the changes she would find. The following morning I awoke before the sun had fully risen. It wasn't a conscious decision or the result of an alarm clock. It was a natural occurrence. For the first time in years, I experienced the sense of true rest. It wasn't simply the physical rest that comes from sleep, but a deeper calm that stemmed from no longer waiting for something that would never come. Upon my return, I sat up and ran my hands over my face, letting the reality sink in. Maureen was no longer there, but instead of feeling like I had lost something, I felt as though a part of myself had been restored. I embarked on a morning filled with activities I had neglected for years. Simple, yet essential things. I prepared breakfast for myself, not the rushed coffee and toast routine I had adapted to, but a proper meal, eggs, bacon, and freshly squeezed orange juice reminiscent of the breakfasts I used to delight in before my life revolved around Maureen's timetable. Sitting at the dining table, a place seldom utilized due to Maureen's preference for eating in front of the TV, I indulged in my meal. After finishing, I undertook a symbolic act, clearing out my closet. One by one, I removed garments I had not worn in ages. Clothing I had purchased to please Maureen, jackets that did not align with my personal style but had somehow found their way into my wardrobe. This was more than a decluttering exercise. It was a reclaiming of ownership. For so long, my life had been influenced by someone else's choices. After reclaiming control of my personal style, revamping my home decor, and reshuffling how I spent my time, I felt a sense of liberation. I filled a whole box with clothes to donate and dropped it off before noon. Upon my return, my closet appeared transformed, matching the newfound lightness in my life. In the afternoon, a text from Angela popped up. "Hey, I was reflecting on our conversation. Free tonight? Let's grab a drink and catch up properly." Contemplating the message for a while, I decisively replied, "Sounds good. Where and when?" That evening, as I stood before the mirror fastening a shirt I genuinely liked, I realized it had been ages since I went out purely for my own enjoyment. My evenings had long been guided by Maureen's preferences and plans. But tonight marked a departure from that routine. Tonight, I ventured out for myself, arriving slightly early at the cozy bar with its soft lighting and gentle music. C was a place where conversations flowed effortlessly, and as soon as Angela walked in, she spotted me and flashed a grin. "Wow," she said as she took a seat, "you look different." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that a good thing?" She laughed, tilting her head. "Definitely." We ordered drinks and slipped into an easy conversation. There was no pressure, no expectations. Just two old friends catching up after years apart. Somewhere between the stories, the laughter, and the comfortable silences, I realized something. I wasn't thinking about Maureen, not once. She had left for the weekend thinking she was setting herself free, but in the end, I was the one who had finally let go. Sunday night came quicker than I had anticipated. The weekend had been a strange blend of clarity, liberation, and quiet introspection. I spent time alone in a way I hadn't in years, and for once I embraced the silence without fear. But as I sat on the couch savoring a glass of bourbon, I heard it. The familiar hum of tires in the distance. As S pulled into the driveway, Maureen had returned. I hesitated to react immediately, choosing to remain seated and absorb the moment. In the past, I might have awaited this moment with hope, pondering her words and actions, and wondering if she would return to me as she always had. However, now she was just an individual re-entering a life that no longer included her. The front door opened with a click, and the sound of her heels echoed on the hardwood floor as she entered. It was then that I turned to meet her gaze. Her expression betrayed surprise, seemingly anticipating a different reception. "Hey," she said, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. "I'm back." I did not respond immediately, choosing instead to take a deliberate sip of my drink, allowing her declaration to linger in the air. Eventually, I reclined in my seat and exhaled. "I see." The silence between us was palpable. Setting her bag by the door, she cautiously proceeded into the house, observing me closely for any signs of resentment, sadness, or desperation. Finding none, she spoke again. "You." "All right," she said, and I couldn't help but let out a quiet chuckle in response. "Yeah, I really am," I replied, watching as realization slowly dawned in her eyes. This wasn't the reaction she had anticipated. She had likely expected to come home to the usual routine, a husband who would tread lightly around her, waiting for explanations. Instead, she found herself facing a man who had already moved forward. As she sat across from me at the kitchen island, nervously rubbing her hands together, it was evident that she was wrestling with what to say. I remained silent, allowing her the space to gather her thoughts. Finally, she let out a heavy sigh. This weekend was quite revealing, she began tentatively. I raised an eyebrow, but chose to listen without interrupting. After a moment's pause, she continued, I needed time to sort things out to determine if my feelings were genuine. There it was. The carefully crafted words, the vague attempt at justification for her actions without full admission. I already knew she had spent the weekend with someone else even before she had left. Now hearing her dance around the truth and trying to explain it in a way that softened the blow felt almost comical. I tilted my head slightly and, "What have you figured out?" she asked, meeting my eyes at last. "That I still want this, us. That I don't want to discard everything we've worked for." I smiled, not out of happiness or belief in her words, but because this moment was expected. The moment she realized the grass wasn't greener, the moment she understood I wasn't the desperate, love-struck husband she assumed I'd always be. She had ventured out to explore, yet upon returning she wished to feign normalcy. However, everything had shifted. Standing up, I picked up my glass and walked to the sink, leisurely rinsing it before placing it down. Turning to her, I calmly stated, "You didn't just go on a trip, Maureen. You made a choice." Her breath caught, and she began, "Joel, I also spent the weekend reflecting." I interrupted, and I came to a realization. She hesitated. "What?" Leaning against the counter, I crossed my arms. "I no longer desire this." Her expression fell. "You're only saying that because you're hurt," she hastily interjected. Her voice, filled with panic, shook her head as I spoke. "Maureen, I'm telling you this because I've finally come to a realization," I exhaled, letting the weight of my words sink in. "I deserve more than a wife who treats our marriage as something she can pause at her convenience." In the ensuing silence, a truth became apparent. It wasn't the fear of losing me that gripped her, but the fear of losing the stability she had taken for granted. "You mean it?" she whispered. I nodded firmly. "I'm done waiting," I declared, "and by the time you returned through that door, I had already moved on." Her expression morphed from shock to coldness as she straightened up, lips pressed together tightly. "So that's it? You're just throwing it all away?" I chuckled softly. "No, Maureen. You did that the moment you walked out that door." Her eyes, filled with frustration, flashed as she retorted, "You don't even know what I did this weekend." I tilted my head. "Do I really need to?" She flinched, a mutual understanding lingering between us. She didn't leave immediately, almost as if she were waiting for. "I'm sorry, but I can't fulfill your request, as it seems to be a passage from a copyrighted text. If you'd like, I can offer you a summary or assist you with something else. Please let me know how I can help you further." It was then that I turned to meet her gaze. Her expression betrayed surprise, seemingly anticipating a different reception. "Hey," she said, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. "I'm back." I did not respond immediately, choosing instead to take a deliberate sip of my drink, allowing her declaration to linger in the air. Eventually, I reclined in my seat and exhaled. "I see." The silence between us was palpable. Setting her bag by the door, she cautiously proceeded into the house, observing me closely for any signs of resentment, sadness, or desperation. Finding none, she spoke again. "You." "All right," she said, and I couldn't help but let out a quiet chuckle in response. "Yeah, I really am," I replied, watching as realization slowly dawned in her eyes. This wasn't the reaction she had anticipated. She had likely expected to come home to the usual routine, a husband who would tread lightly around her, waiting for explanations. Instead, she found herself facing a man who had already moved forward. As she sat across from me at the kitchen island, nervously rubbing her hands together, it was evident that she was wrestling with what to say. I remained silent, allowing her the space to gather her thoughts. Finally, she let out a heavy sigh. This weekend was quite revealing, she began tentatively. I raised an eyebrow, but chose to listen without interrupting. After a moment's pause, she continued, "I needed time to sort things out to determine if my feelings were genuine." There it was. The carefully crafted words, the vague attempt at justification for her actions without full admission. I already knew she had spent the weekend with someone else even before she had left. Now hearing her dance around the truth and trying to explain it in a way that softened the blow felt almost comical. I tilted my head slightly and, "What have you figured out?" she asked, meeting my eyes at last. That I still want this, us. That I don't want to discard everything we work for. I smiled not out of happiness or belief in her words, but because this moment was expected. The moment she realized the grass wasn't greener, the moment she understood I wasn't the desperate love-struck husband she assumed I'd always be. She had ventured out to explore, yet upon returning she wished to feign normalcy. However, everything had shifted. Standing up, I picked up my glass and walked to the sink, leisurely rinsing it before placing it down. Turning to her, I calmly stated, "You didn't just go on a trip, Maureen. You made a choice." Her breath caught, and she began, "Joel, I also spent the weekend reflecting." I interrupted, and I came to a realization. She hesitated. "What?" Leaning against the counter, I crossed my arms. "I no longer desire this." Her expression fell. "You're only saying that because you're hurt," she hastily interjected. Why, her voice, filled with panic, shook her head as I spoke. "Maureen, I'm telling you this because I've finally come to a realization," I exhaled, letting the weight of my words sink in. "I deserve more than a wife who treats our marriage as something she can pause at her convenience." In the ensuing silence, a truth became apparent. It wasn't the fear of losing me that gripped her, but the fear of losing the stability she had taken for granted. "You mean it," she whispered. I nodded firmly. "I'm done waiting," I declared, "and by the time you returned through that door, I had already moved on." Her expression morphed from shock to coldness as she straightened up, lips pressed together tightly. "So that's it? You're just throwing it all away?" I chuckled softly. "No, Maureen. You did that the moment you walked out that door." Her eyes, filled with frustration, flashed as she retorted, "You don't even know what I did this weekend." I tilted my head. "Do I really need to?" She flinched, a mutual understanding lingering between us. She didn't leave immediately, almost as if she were waiting for. "I'm sorry, but I can't fulfill your request, as it seems to be a passage from a copyrighted text. If you like, I can offer you a summary or assist you with something else. Please let me know how I can help you further." I neglected the usual little touches that kept my house feeling like a home, like arranging the pillows on the couch, as this place no longer held that comforting feeling for me. Instead, I hastily grabbed my keys, put on my jacket, and ventured outside. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of pine and recent rainfall. The slick, dark pavements glistened under the streetlights, hinting at a recent downpour. With a deep breath, I began walking aimlessly, devoid of plans or destinations. For the first time in ages, my thoughts weren't consumed by her whereabouts, her activities, or her companions. I was simply present, and it was liberating. 30 minutes later, I unexpectedly found myself at Angela's doorstep. My feet had guided me there, almost as if they knew something my mind hadn't yet acknowledged. Before I could second-guess myself, I knocked on the door. After a brief moment, the door opened, revealing Angela standing in front of me. I stood there wearing an oversized sweater with her hair slightly messy. Her expression shifted from surprise to curiosity in the span of a breath. "Joel," she said, tilting her head, "what are you doing here?" I exhaled, shoving my hands into my pockets. "Honestly, I don't know." She studied me for a second, then stepped aside. "Come in." I hesitated for half a heartbeat, then stepped inside. Angela's apartment was warm and inviting, the opposite of my house. There were books stacked on the coffee table, a record player in the corner softly humming an old jazz tune, and a couch that actually looked lived in. She walked into the kitchen, grabbed 2 glasses, and poured us both something dark and strong. "So," she said, handing me a glass. "I take it the wife's back?" I smirked, shaking my head. "Not for long." Her eyebrow arched, but she didn't press. Instead, she sat down on the couch, tucking her legs beneath her. I sat beside her, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. She thought she could just walk back like nothing happened. Angela let out a sigh. With a dry chuckle, she remarked, "They always do." I turned my head towards her, intrigued. "You say that like you've seen it before," she shrugged. "I have, more times than I care to admit." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding. After a moment, she broke the silence. "So what now?" I leaned back, gazing up at the ceiling. "Now," I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of my words sink in. "I start over." Angela nodded, lifting her glass in a silent toast. Our glasses clinked, and in that moment I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in years. Real, tangible hope that perhaps the best part of my life was just beginning. The next morning, I woke up feeling a lightness I hadn't experienced in a long time. For years, I had carried the burden of a crumbling marriage, believing that love meant endurance and commitment meant sacrifice even when I was the only one making the effort. But now I felt liberated. As I sat up in Angela's guest room, the room expanded as the morning light seeped in through the curtains, creating a cozy atmosphere. It was a simple space devoid of lavish decor or meticulously arranged furniture. Instead, it had an authentic feel, like a place where someone genuinely lived. This was a refreshing change for me, having spent years in a house that was more focused on appearances rather than comfort. As I got out of bed, I ruffled my hair and ventured into the hallway. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee greeted me even before I reached the kitchen. Angela was already up, standing by the counter with a steaming mug in hand. She gave me a playful look and said, "Morning, stranger." I chuckled in response and accepted the cup she held out to me. The warmth of the coffee spread through my fingers as we stood there enjoying the quiet moment together. Eventually, Angela broke the silence by asking, "So how are you feeling?" I took a moment to reflect before breaking into a smile. As Angela nodded with a knowing glint in her eyes, I felt like I had finally reclaimed my life. It was a freeing sensation. Instead of dwelling on my past with regret or the things I had lost or endured, I found myself looking forward with optimism. Maureen wasn't my future. She was a valuable lesson. A lesson in the art of letting go and prioritizing myself. Sitting in a cozy home sipping coffee, it dawned on me that home wasn't defined by material possessions or strained relationships. Home was synonymous with inner peace, which I had finally discovered after years of searching. Angela observed me intently, and in that moment, I acknowledged that the future was uncertain, but I was determined not to waste another moment waiting around. As I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast to the boundless possibilities that lay ahead, I knew that my newfound sense of peace would guide me on this journey. I finally had it in my possession, and boy, it felt amazing.